Hi everyone, and welcome to the Introduction to Performance Assessments webinar. We have several presenters here to lead our discussion today. My name is Carmen Arauz, and you can see my picture at the top of the first column there. Also with us today are my colleagues Emma Pellerin, Corey Hamilton-Viagas, and Jessica Bailey from REL Appalachia, and Ann Peterson from the Virginia Department of Education. We also want to introduce the real stars of today's webinar, Erin Lowery and Carrie Roop. Erin and Carrie are science teachers in Prince William County Public Schools. They are here today as our performance assessment implementation experts. You'll hear about their experiences implementing performance assessments in science later in today's webinar. Finally, we wanted to take a minute to acknowledge a few other individuals who've been instrumental in supporting this project. Beth McBride is an education researcher formerly with RSRI who led parts of this project. Jennifer Powell is a science coordinator at Arlington County Public Schools, and Gina Townsend is a science coordinator at Prince William County Public Schools. Both Jennifer and Gina have been great supports to the teachers in their counties participating in this project and provided feedback on the materials that you'll see today. We're very grateful for their participation. And so we also want to thank you all for being here with us today. It looks like we have everybody in the room is from Virginia, which is great because this information is definitely geared towards your demographics in your area. And most of our folks on the call are either teachers or teacher leaders and maybe a couple of district folks. So thank you all for joining us. And we also ask you to share with us your familiarity with implementing performance assessments. And it looks like most of you are somewhat familiar with performance assessments, and then maybe we have a smaller number who are less familiar, which is great. I think there's content in this webinar for all of you, and so we hope that everybody has an opportunity to learn something and get something out of their participation today. So we'll go ahead and get started. This webinar is part of a two-part series on implementing high-quality performance assessments in science. The webinars are the culminating events for an 18-month-long coaching project REL AP staff started with Virginia teachers in the fall of 2019. During these webinars, our goal is to leverage the work from the coaching projects to increase understanding of research and strategies for implementing high-quality performance assessments with a larger audience. Today, we'll introduce you to the project and share highlights from the research on performance assessments. We'll also introduce many of you to the Virginia Quality Criteria Review Tool for Performance Assessments, which was created by the Virginia Department of Education. Through the REL AP Performance Assessment Project, REL AP staff developed a four-step process to support teachers' use of the criteria tool and classroom implementation of performance assessments. During today's webinar, we'll share an overview of the four-step process and take a deep dive into steps 1 through 3, which focus on selecting and enhancing performance assessments. We'll take a closer look at step 4 of the process and focus on administration of the assessment during webinar 2, which is scheduled for next Tuesday, August 11th. And we hope you also will join us for that. While this session will touch on how distance learning can influence planning and administering performance assessments, the second webinar will include more concrete examples of how teachers can administer performance assessments given the current circumstances many schools and classrooms in our region are facing right now. Our goals for today are to provide an overview of the evidence-based research related to implementing performance assessments, as well as improve educators' understanding of the Virginia Quality Criteria Review Tool and support educators' use of the criteria tool using the four-step process. We're also excited to showcase exemplar implementation of performance assessments in science classrooms. I'm going to turn it over now to Corey Hamilton-Viagas, who will share more about the project background.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Next slide, please. The REL Appalachia Implementing High Quality Performance Assessments in Science project has 3 phases. It ran August through October 2019. During that first phase of August through October 2019, the REL team hosted a small group of science teachers in Arlington and Prince William County for 2 coaching workshops to, 1, increase educators' ability to implement high-quality performance assessments that support effective teaching and learning practices in the classroom. And 2, develop and provide teachers with supplemental materials to support use of the quality criteria tool. As workshop participants, teachers attended 2 training workshops, shared insights on planning and implementing performance assessments in science, provided feedback on support materials developed by REL Appalachia. For Phase 2, which was the implementation phase, the REL team worked with a select group of teachers from Phase 1 for individual coaching activities ahead of their performance assessment implementation and classroom visits to video record quality performance assessment being implemented in the classroom. During individual coaching and classroom video recording, teachers participated in individual pre-implementation coaching calls with the REL Appalachia team around their performance assessment, hosted classroom recording sessions while implementing a science performance assessment, and participated in individual post-implementation coaching call with the REL Appalachia team. They were also able to contribute to a large group debrief with the REL Appalachia team. The final phase, which is taking place in August 2020, we have our teachers presenting during this workshop and sharing their insight as implementers. As facilitators for today's webinar, teachers worked with the REL Appalachia team to develop their slides and talking points. Throughout the project, teachers have shared their experiences and input while implementing performance assessments and using the criteria tool. This feedback has informed the supports provided to teachers throughout the project and are included in the materials we will share with you during today's webinar. All of the resources developed for the project are included in the Implementing High Quality Performance Assessments in Science workbook. That's quite a mouthful. The workbook can be accessed on the REL Appalachia website and used independently as a resource when planning and implementing a performance assessment. The link to the project page and related resources will be available at the end of the webinar on the resource slide. Now that we have heard some background on the project, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Bailey for more on the evidence-based research on implementing performance assessments. Jessica?
Thanks, Corey. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here today and that you all have power, hopefully, and are able to participate in this webinar. So in addition to talking about just the research, I want to provide a little kind of background information about what even are performance assessments. And so oftentimes I hear people using these terms interchangeably. They'll say performance assessment or performance task, and I'd like to just clarify what we mean by each here. When we're talking about performance assessments in this webinar, we're talking about the big picture here, kind of like an umbrella. A performance assessment, when we talk about it, refers to everything that's included, which could be the assessment blueprint, which is a table that aligns the performance tasks to their associated standards, the instructions for the teacher, the rubric that you'd use to score it, and any information about the needed materials. It also then includes the performance task. The performance task itself is really the prompt in student instructions. So that's what you are giving to the students. So now that we've clarified that, let me move on and talk a little bit more about what these components of a performance assessment are. So they would include the standards and learning expectations that are being assessed, any relevant background information. Oftentimes when you see a performance assessment, it will indicate the grade, the subject, the title, the materials that are needed for it. Then it would include the task, so the prompt and any directions for students. It might also include administration information, so or teacher instruction, so information for you on what you need to administer it. What do you do if students need more time? Explaining those types of things for you. And then, of course, it should include a rubric for scoring. So those are the things that you would be looking for if you are looking for a performance assessment from a resource bank, or these are the things that you would want to create if you're creating your own performance assessment. So now let's look at a few examples. So you may be familiar with all of these types of assessments, and you may not even realize that some of these would fall into the performance assessment category. So some really common performance assessment examples include an essay or a report. Group projects and individual projects are also considered a performance assessment. Student demonstrations, where they might show something either right in front of you or they've recorded a video of them doing it, is also a performance assessment. They could do an actual performance. Think about art class or theater arts where they're doing some kind of actual performance. They could do journals, student logs, video diaries, and so on. So those are a couple different types of examples. And you might be wondering if these are relevant for use in a distance learning or remote learning environment. And the answer is yes. Many of these can easily be transferred and facilitated through online platforms like Zoom. For example, essays, reports, journals, all of those come to mind as something that's really easy to transfer over to remote learning. But even group projects and demonstrations can be facilitated remotely, assuming that the students have the necessary materials. But online platforms like Zoom definitely make this possible for students to be able to get together, to record themselves doing things. So I just want you to keep that in the back of the mind if that's where your state is right now in terms of fall plans, that this still is very relevant to what you're doing. Okay, so now you might be wondering, when would you use a performance assessment versus a traditional academic knowledge and skills assessment? So there's many reasons why you might want to use a performance assessment over a traditional assessment. In many cases, a performance assessment can be helpful to evaluate skills other than content knowledge. So for example, 21st century skills such as higher order thinking skills like critical thinking, problem solving, as well as social emotional learning skills, things like motivation, persistence, interpersonal skills. All of these are easily assessed through a performance assessment. Performance assessments lend themselves very well to assessing these types of skills. Today we're talking a lot about science, and you'll be hearing from our teachers who have implemented science assessments, and so they can attest to how performance assessments lend themselves very well to assessing scientific skills and practices, like planning and carrying out an investigation or analyzing and interpreting data. Okay. Again, I think these are very, performance assessments are very well aligned to administering, to when you want to administer an assessment, but you don't want to use a traditional assessment, such as during our current circumstances. If you're doing remote learning, it may be better to do a performance assessment that is more collaborative or evaluating these skills, even if from a distance. Okay, so now a little bit about the research on performance assessment. So there's actually been years worth of research from performance assessment experts on its use. And so research suggests that performance assessments can support changes in teachers' instructional practices. For example, by using performance assessments and their data, teachers are inherently just given opportunities to develop strategies that deepen students' critical thinking and problem-solving skills. They're also better able to promote the use of complex problem-solving and reasoning skills for their students. Research also shows many benefits for students, such as increases in students' academic and interpersonal skill development, their engagement in school, and even post-secondary success. So some long-term studies have tracked the use of performance assessment and how this has led to post-secondary success. Often, performance assessments are used in a post-secondary school as well. But the engagement piece is really important, and just to talk about that for one more minute, students often feel more engaged in this process. They can take ownership of it. You can give them a lot of leeway in their topic, and they can get really excited about it. And I think you'll hear from our teacher panelists about that as well. So now let me just turn to your experience with performance assessments. It sounds like from our poll that many of you are already familiar with performance assessments. But I'd love to hear in the chat, if you want to just type in, have you administered any performance assessments? If so, what was the topic and grade level? What have you found challenging about implementing a performance assessment? And what have you found beneficial about implementing a performance assessment? So go ahead and add some thoughts into the chat, and then we'll turn it over to our teacher panelists to hear about it. I see that many of you are typing. Thank you for participating. Again, if you want to just mention what the topic level, the grade level, and some challenges and benefits. Okay, so I see that Mary Frances Morris, you've done project-based learning at the end of a unit. I'm wondering if this was a performance assessment. Yes, I think that, to answer your question, I think it could certainly be considered a performance assessment depending upon the type of project that you did and how you graded it. And obviously I don't know much more than what you said there, Mary Frances, but most likely. Let's see, Amanda says she's created performance assessments, really never had the opportunity to implement them. That's interesting. They can take a lot of effort to implement and score and class time to do, so that is a valid concern. Jennifer's done a variety of types, like essays and projects. I love that they are all self-differentiating as students will rise to levels that they are able to at that time. Yes, it's a really great benefit. Ginger kind of nailed it on the head. The biggest challenge is time. And our teacher panelists can definitely speak to that later as well. And I welcome you if any of you have ideas about how you manage time to do it, time to score it, all of that. Feel free to put that in the chat. Michaela says her performance-based assessments were used in U.S. history, 6th grade, a self-contained class. It was difficult for my kiddos to do. Feel free to put a little bit more in there, Michaela, if you'd like to share, like what was difficult. Amber had said grading always seems to be time-consuming with performance assessment. Right, yes. So we will talk about rubrics in the second webinar of this series. And so if you have a really strong rubric, the grading can go much faster. So we'll talk about that. I hope that you can join us next time for that. Mary Beth has done a performance assessment, let's see, on the watershed. That's great. They enjoyed it. They had a lot of fun, lots of creative ideas. Like, that's what's really great. Assessment doesn't have to be something that students dread and get anxiety over. They can engage and be having a lot of fun doing it. So thank you so much. I'm going to keep moving us along, but please continue to keep putting your thoughts and reflections in here about your experiences with performance assessment. But for right now, I'm going to turn it over to, in 1 minute, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists so they can get ready to talk about their experiences. As some of you talked about in your chat, there are many benefits of performance assessments. One of those was engaging. I heard some of you talk about that. As I mentioned before, from the research that's shown that they're really well suited to assess complex standards and skills. They can support personalization. Someone else touched on that as well, that it allows you to assess where your students are at that time. They can rise to the level that they're at. They can be very authentic, and also gives you a time as performance assessments can sometimes be produced over many days or even weeks. If you think about a portfolio, they can provide you with formative and summative feedback. So let me turn it over to Ms. Carrie Roop and Ms. Erin Lowry so you can share some of the benefits that you experienced when implementing your performance assessment.
Hi everyone, this is Carrie. Thanks, Jessica. Two of the benefits that I had this year with doing the project-based learning was I saw a great student participation. All of my kids got very excited when they learned that they were going to make a three-dimensional ocean in a box. Also, another great benefit for me was one of my level 1 ESOL students who only spoke Spanish was able to translate it for another student who came in to observe him. And so he explained everything in his box, and he used his vocabulary to do it. So he was showing his understanding, and he got very excited about that too. Thanks, Carrie. Some of the benefits that I saw were definitely student engagement, especially my special education students and my ELs, especially the lower level, and my gifted students. I think they appreciated the student choice. I allowed them to choose their own path of their plan of attack and their ending product and their use of technology. It was a relevant, authentic learning experience. The kids were also able to relate to it. And it was not just memorizing and regurgitating information. They had to analyze, synthesize, and create connections across the content, and they did it successfully.
Thank you so much, Erin and Carrie. That was wonderful, and definitely echoing what some of the respondents in the chat are also mentioning. So we talked about the benefits. Now, we can't ignore that there are some challenges or factors to consider when you're implementing a performance assessment. So as you are probably all familiar, they can take extra time not only to either create or find, but to administer. And then also scoring too. Some have mentioned that. They can be time consuming to score and evaluate. And they just also require a lot of your preparation. So whether you're starting from scratch or whether you've already found an assessment that you want to use, it still is going to take some time. I know when Carrie was doing her ocean models in the shoebox, there was a lot of planning that she had to do to get the materials and just get all of those, outside of school time to get all the materials. So that can be a lot. I'd love to hear from you all what some of your challenges might have been. And let me turn it over also to Carrie and Erin one more time to talk about some of the factors that they considered when administering their performance assessments.
Thank you, Jessica. It's Carrie again. Three things came to mind when I was implementing my assessments and getting ready to do this one. One was to make sure it was student-friendly. I wanted to make sure that it could hit all of the levels that I have in my 5th grade classroom. So I had to look within my own classroom and the needs of that class. Also, I needed to make sure that it covered the expectations for student learning. I wanted to make sure that it covered the Virginia SOLs. And then the third thing was time. Make sure that I gave enough time for my students and enough time for myself to actually plan it and make sure that it had everything that I needed it to have. And here's Erin. I had a couple things to think about as well. I can't stress enough, know your audience, know your students, know their strengths and their weaknesses. You need to know how to put your groups together, taking into consideration your special education and your ELs, technical challenges they might face, and knowing what my resources were, including special education and ESOL teachers. Giving yourself plenty of time, looking at what unit you want to implement, what is the pace of that unit, does the PBA encompass the whole unit or just a part of it? How long do you want them to work on it, and then start working? I would recommend maybe about a month out or so from introducing it to your students. And then, of course, the grading. It takes a lot of time. It really does. So you have to give yourself that time to do it. What I did was record my students as they were presenting, so I was not trying to grade at the same time that they were speaking so that I didn't miss out on anything. And so I would recommend approaching it that way as well.
All right, thank you both. Those are great ideas and great considerations. Okay, so you don't have to do this alone. There are many supports available to you as you are implementing performance assessments. So if you don't know where to start, there are lots of performance assessment repositories out there. So if you were to Google, performance assessments for your grade or in your subject area, you'll come across ones. There's Scale at Stanford is one that comes to mind. That's pretty well known. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can also depend upon other educators in your building or in your district. So I would also start there. Those might be the ones that are most relevant to what you're teaching and the standards in your state. Anytime you are using an assessment, and particularly performance assessment, you'll want to have a standards-aligned rubric. I think that's one of the biggest pieces that can be time-consuming in terms of the scoring, but if you have a really well-done rubric, then that can make that whole process more efficient and really worth it, because the information that's being provided to the students and you as a teacher is really meaningful. So make sure that you're looking for that. Also, there's professional development available, and Emma just put a link to a resource that I helped create for the REL Northeast and Islands. It's actually launching this week. I'm very excited. It's a free, self-paced online course. There's 5 modules that bring you through the process of start to finish of how to create a high-quality performance assessment. So Emma just put the link to that in the chat. So there are, free professional development resources out there. There's also ones that you can pay for, but I would recommend the REL Northeast and Islands one since it's free and vetted by lots of experts in the field. You'll also want to connect with your local education agencies, your district folk, your curriculum leaders, as well as state education agencies. So we're going to turn it over now to Ann Peterson, who's at the Virginia Department of Education. She is someone who you can look to if you're in Virginia as a resource to help you with understanding performance assessments. And she's going to walk you through one of the resources available to Virginia teachers, which is called the Virginia Quality Criteria Review Tool. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Ann.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. This is Ann Peterson, and I am so honored that REL asked me to be included on this webinar and excited to teach you all as science teachers, or to talk to you as science teachers. I taught science as well for 24 years, and I found that science is performance assessments. And I think you'll notice when you look at the 2018 Science Standards of Learning, there is great opportunity for performance assessment using those standards. All of those leaves that you see in the essential knowledge and skills can be performance assessments. In fact, we're starting to make them now, and they should be published within the next few months. So what do we have on the site currently in terms of resources? Well, as Jessica said, we have the Virginia Quality Criterion Tool, and this is a tool for looking at performance assessments. I think you'll talk or realize in some of the discussions you have today and next week that this isn't about always making assessments from scratch. What you could do is also look at existing assessments determine where the gaps are, and then make them your own. On the web page as well, on the DOE site, we also have common rubrics for each of the 4 core disciplines, and we have exemplar performance tasks. Right now, we currently have those performance tasks for 3rd grade, and it is expected in the state of Virginia that all 3rd graders in science engage in performance assessments. But we also have science assessments for 6th grade and chemistry on the site, and again, we're making more for all grade levels. We have the common rubrics, and those common rubrics exist for grades K2, 3-5, 6-8, and 9-12, and they're based on the science and engineering practices. We have student versions of the rubrics for K2 and 3-5, and we also have teacher guides. All of them can be found on the DOE site. So I was asked today to go over just one of those resources, and again, that's the Virginia Quality Criterion Review Tool. And this is a tool that you can use when looking at your own performance assessment or evaluating performance assessments that you find on the web. I think you'll notice that just like lesson plans, not everything is necessarily the best product it can be when you find it on the internet. So this kind of gives you some guidance or a platform for reviewing these. Now the Virginia Quality Criterion Tool is divided into different sections. And this first section is dealing with whether it meets or matches the intended learning outcomes. And the most important thing you should look at is this actually aligned to the Virginia Standards of Learning. So is it listed, are the clearly, performance assessments should have the SOLs clearly listed in the task, should be developmentally appropriate for targeted students, and aligned to the grade level scope and sequence or grade level curriculum. Performance assessment components, resource materials, and student products are aligned to the listed SOLs. If they aren't aligned, or if that expectation isn't appropriate for that grade level, then you need to either revise that performance assessment or maybe start looking for a different one. The second portion of that criterion is that the performance assessment goes beyond simple recall. It elicits evidence of complex student thinking and requires application of disciplinary or cross-disciplinary concepts, practices, and/or transferable skills such as application, analysis, evaluation, synthesis, or original creation. We have been in a multiple choice generation for way too long, and performance assessment allows us to test things beyond the first couple of levels of Bloom's. The third thing within that first standard is that the performance assessment provides an opportunity for students to develop and demonstrate deeper learning competencies. And these deeper learning competencies are collaboration, critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, and citizenship. So if we have those opportunities for kids to engage and build those skills through performance assessment, we want to encourage it. These life-ready competencies are defined by the profile of graduate as content knowledge, career planning, workplace skills, and community and civic responsiveness. The next section is authenticity. And I look at this, we want to make sure, first of all, that the scenario is authentic to the discipline. Is this something that maybe a scientist really would be doing, or is this an authentic way to get at that content that you need to have? So the performance assessment is authentic along the dimensions. The topic, context, materials, resources, and purpose audience are relevant to the real world student community, student interest, future careers, and other meaningful contexts. The performance assessment asks students to do work authentic to the discipline, such as science inquiry, math problem solving if appropriate, analyzing, critiquing tests, analyzing and evaluating historical sources. Just depends on which discipline you're looking at. The third section of the criterion tool is language used for expressing reasoning. And In this one, it supports language use and development through multiple means of assessing and using academic and disciplinary language in order to express reasoning. Also, that students requires students to use one or more forms of language to communicate their reasoning. Functional, academic, discipline language in various forms, text, video, audio, oral, or use multiple means of expression and language production. So they are going to either utilize or produce something using multiple means of communication. In the next section, it's criterion 4, success criterion for students. Now in 4A, the performance assessment includes a rubric or other appropriate scoring tool, checklist, analytic rubric, with scoring dimensions that are tightly aligned to the performance expectations of the intended learning outcomes, targeted within the performance assessment. Criteria should include language objectives if applicable. Now be aware, if this is a third grade assessment that is being used as part of your balanced assessment plan, the expectation is that you use that third grade common rubric that can be found on the Virginia Department of Education website. That is only the expectation for third grade because it was determined to be a replaced SOL. Those common rubrics are available for all other grade levels, and they are vertically aligned so that students can show growth throughout their K-12 experience. However, they are not required outside of any grade but third grade at this time. The second part of that criteria is that the scoring tool is clearly written and it's concise, it's audience-friendly. The audience-friendly language of the scoring tool should describe how a response demonstrates performance expectations so that the tool may be used to provide feedback to students about their work and how it can be improved. The next criterion is student directions, prompt, and resources and materials. So in this, the student-facing prompt, directions, and resources are aligned to the intended learning outcomes, the task purpose, and the performance expectations being addressed. In 5B, the student-facing task prompt, directions, resources, and materials are clear, complete, written in accessible language appropriate to the grade level, and organized for the student in an accessible format. So that might be a bulleted list or some sort of directions that's easier for the students to interpret. In 5C, the task prompt directions, topic, context, and materials are sensitive to the community and free of bias. And in science, in social studies, in some of these areas, that free of bias could be interpreted as different readings that students are going to be working at. In science, it might just be exploring maybe the nature of science through looking at different scientists that represent all sorts of different diverse backgrounds. In criterion 6, it's accessibility. The performance assessment is designed to accommodate the participation of all students. Directions for teachers for the performance assessment identify appropriate supports or alternatives to facilitate accessibility while maintaining the validity and reliability of students. All students are expected to do performance assessments, and we need to make sure that they have the tools that are necessary for them to be able to complete it. In 6B, the performance assessment is accessible and allows for differentiating the ways that students demonstrate their knowledge, such as through the application of principles of universal design for learning. And there are some references there that can be used by the teacher in determining those tools. Last but not least, the criterion number 7 is going to be feasibility. So in this one, 7A, students facing prompts, directions, resources, materials, and scoring tools are included. Resources and materials required by the performance assessment are realistic and easily accessible to teachers. And I think we'll find that when you look at the third grade performance assessments designed or included on the Virginia Department of Ed website. We are very conscientious in selecting materials that are cheap and that are easy to find. In 7B, in terms of feasibility, the duration of implementation of the performance assessment is indicated and is realistic for the complexity of the assessment and the scope of performance expectations being assessed. Now, one thing I heard is that performance assessments take time, and that is true, but sometimes it could be a class period. It just depends on the type of performance assessment and what objectives you're going to cover. In 7C, if the performance assessment is implemented over multiple lessons, a schedule indicating how the performance assessment is implemented across the lessons is included. Information about students' prior learning and how the performance assessment fits within a learning sequence is included. And I am happy to say we have the science instructional plans, which we are going to release next month, and some of those are going to be made into performance assessment, clearly indicate where the prior learning is, as well as the vertical learning progressions for the content in each of the performance assessments. Now, what is tricky is some of the language in the quality criterion tool. So you're going to see different wording. First of all, when the criteria includes a laundry list of requirements joined by end, we think of the quality levels this way, because the end suggests that all elements are important. So when you see that end, they have to have both or multiple things in place for that performance assessment to meet the criteria outlined in the quality criterion tool. When the criteria includes a list of requirements where some of the criteria are joined by ends and some are by ors, we can be a little bit loose in the interpretation of those criteria. So ends, they must have, ors can be a bit looser in our interpretation. Not all elements are required. Examples could be in criteria 1B. It says cognitive complexity, both complex thinking and application of disciplinary learning is required. So you have to have both. In other ones, the or such as, you may be able to satisfy a requirement in a different way. The criterion in 1C includes the use of a number of qualifying language terms, such as may, or even in not may excessively assessed. This indicates that meeting this this indicates that meeting this element of the criterion is a non-negotiable. There are many ways to satisfy this criterion by including opportunities to develop and demonstrate deeper learning competencies, which include a wide array of skills, including mastery of rigorous academic content, learning how to think critically and solve problems, working collaboratively, communicating effectively, directing one's own learning, and developing an academic mindset, or to develop and demonstrate life-ready competencies as captured in the profile of a graduate. You could also see that it's where it says technology-related competencies or integrated learning across multiple content. So there is some flexibility depending on what the tool is and how that criterion could be defined. It's going to be aligned to, as I said, the standard, your learning goals, and then from there, you could determine what things are necessary based on that quality criterion tool. Notice that some of these competencies are not as easy to assess in a performance task. How do you assess collaboration? How do you assess academic mindset? That is why there is language, even if not explicitly assessed, because that is very difficult to assess. So we're excited about your work. We're excited about the quality criterion tool, and I will say we have used it many times. The first few times it's intimidating, but once you get used to it, it's very easy to follow, and it is a good guide for selecting or revising performance assessments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. Now that we have a better understanding of some of the background on performance assessments and the research, and we have a good look at the criteria tool, we'll dig into the four-step process developed as part of the REL AP Performance Assessment Project to support teachers in science assessments in Virginia, implementing performance assessments in Virginia. So as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar will focus on steps 1 and 3 of the four-step process for identifying and using performance assessments. The second webinar in this series will cover step 4, which addresses administering a performance assessment, including plans for engaging students. So step 1 in the process, define the purpose and identify standards and intended learning outcomes, looks at the objectives of the assessment. It asks teachers to consider what are the goals you're looking to meet with the performance assessment, what contents and practice standards are you trying to address, and how will you use the results of the performance assessment. Step 2, select the performance assessment, explores key considerations for either designing your own performance assessment or using an existing assessment. Steps 1 and 2 unpack some of the internal aspects of planning and development teachers often engage in but don't always spell out. This is something that we saw in our project with teachers. There's all of this kind of internal planning that teachers do, but it's really helpful to take the time to really plan that out, because we know that some performance assessments can take a longer time to implement. Taking the time to engage with these steps more concretely at the start of the planning can help teachers save time later in their implementation. Step 3, apply the Virginia Quality Criteria Review Tool. Step 3 uses the criteria tool to break down the performance assessment into the sequence of activities, materials, and resources that you'll need to help identify and revise any aspects of the performance assessment that need to be reconsidered in order to support students' learning and demonstrate conceptual understanding. This step considers the changes that need to be made in order to implement the assessment with fidelity. Step 4 of the process is engage students and plan to administer your performance assessment. This step focuses on the ways in which students can be engaged in the assessment process and the preparation needed to implement the performance assessment. Steps 3 and 4 can be iterative and cyclical. The steps are interrelated and build on each other in that teachers are likely to make revisions to their assessment plans for future implementation of the performance assessment. Though our implementation experts used this process to select and implement their assessments last fall, you can see how following a similar process for administering performance assessments in a virtual environment would also be helpful. You'll still want to define the purpose, find the right assessment, and ensure that you're meeting quality criteria, and make plans for administering the assessment while engaging students in a virtual environment. So let's think a little bit more and dig in on the first step of the process. This step helps to determine what purpose the assessment will serve. It includes identifying the student population to be assessed and the content, knowledge, and skills students will be expected to master and/or demonstrate. So let's unpack that a little bit. Who is being assessed? In the context of this work, population refers to the intended grade levels or targeted student groups that will be assessed. The population you identify should align with the specified content standards and learning outcomes for the grade level being assessed. The population can include a single grade level or a span of grades if the assessment is relevant for multiple grades. Why do I need to assess students at this time? There are a variety of reasons for assessing students. It is important to first establish the assessment's purpose or the intended objective of the assessment to make subsequent design decisions that maximize the assessment's effectiveness. What is being assessed? Once teachers have identified the who and the what they'll be assessing, they should then narrow the focus on the specific content standards for the course or content area to be assessed. Teachers can then begin to identify learning outcomes or the evidence related to the content standards that may be measured through the assessment. During our coaching workshops with teachers, we also discussed the different types of assessments, summative and formative, that they were planning to implement, and the need to align the type of assessment to the purpose of their assessment. Similarly, it'll be equally important for teachers planning to administer the performance assessment online to keep the population, purpose, and content standards for their assessments in mind while they're planning in order to meet the assessment objectives that they set out. So now that we've had a bit more time to talk about step one, we'd like to hear from our implementation experts on how they identified the purpose for their assessment. I'll ask each of them to tell you a little bit more about the performance assessments that they implemented and to discuss identifying the purpose. And so Carrie and Erin, if you could tell us who you assessed, why did you assess for students, and what were you assessing? And Carrie, if you could go first.
Oh, never mind. Thank you, Carmen. So for this year, what I was doing, I was looking for science for oceanography in grade 5. And so for my assessment, the purpose of it was to give my 5th grade classroom an opportunity to show me the science vocabulary that they had understood from all of my previous lessons. So I had 22 students in my classroom this year. They were made up of levels 1s, 3s, and 6s for ELL students. I had special education students also in my classroom. Some just came in and pushed in for the science period. So I wanted to assess my students' learning to see how they understood the vocabulary for this unit, and I also put in a communication piece. So I was tying in science with language arts. So it really helped them, and it showed me what they could do when they were presenting to other classes that were asked to come in from 3rd and 4th grade. So with this, they were asked to create a 3D model of the ocean features within a shoebox using the information from either their study of from the study of the unit, and then the model was 3-dimensional and can be made out of recyclable materials. So I brought in a plethora of materials for them to use. Some of my students were like, well, we don't have clay, can we bring that in? So they were actually bringing some of their information in also with this project, and I told them that was fine. But the main goal was for my students to show their knowledge of the ocean features in a way that was not a paper pencil assessment. I liked how the project let my students to show their knowledge in a creative way. I had students actually make fish, and they asked me to buy the little candles to come in with the from the Dollar Tree, and they attached them to make the lantern fish. They had their own ways of designing and using their shoebox. I had some kids that actually built outside the shoebox and made it with 3 levels. So it was really interesting to see all the designs that they came up with. And it really showed me their learning in a very different way. So now I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Thank
you, Carrie. My PBA centered around the human impact of watershed health. Watershed unit in general is not the most exciting information for students to learn about, and so a lot of my approach was how do I make this more interesting for them. So it seemed an appropriate place to put a PBA. I'm 6th grade science at Fred Lynn, and we made this a relevant learning experience by talking about the littering that was going on in and outside of the school and how that littering affects the local water systems, which ultimately lead to our watersheds. So students were challenged to come up with a solution to the littering problem at school, and then they had to pitch their ideas to our school's administration. I chose to do this PBA to allow all of my students the opportunity to show what they know in a manner that was comfortable for them, that gave them the courage to stand in front of their peers, and that challenged them to do something new as well. I assessed 97 6th graders of all abilities, special education, ELs, general education, and our Signet or gifted students. And I needed to assess my students' understanding of human impact on our water systems, particularly watershed health. And this was also a summative assessment. We covered 2 different science SOL standards, and we covered at least 1, but I think 2 language arts standards as well. And the objective for this assessment was to have students describe the importance of careful management of water resources, locate their own local watershed and rivers and streams associated with it, and explain the factors that affect water quality in a watershed and how those factors can affect an ecosystem. And we took the kids on virtual field trips to locate the local waterways that led to our local watershed. We worked hand in hand with our ITC, shout out to Biz Summers, using all types of technology to create their proposals and get their messages across. And it really allowed my students to be super creative in what they were doing, which I think gave them the confidence they needed to create something outstanding to share with their peers and our administration.
Great. Thank you, Carrie and Erin. It sounds like you both had very intentional objectives for your assessments, and that you worked hard to both make them both authentic and accessible to your students. And so that is a great example to share with folks on the call. Let's move on to step 2 of the 4-step process for identifying and using performance assessments. Step 2 of the process focuses on selecting your performance assessment. So the key here is to determine the quality and relevance of a performance assessment before investing significant amounts of time and effort tailoring the content. The checklist we developed as part of the project and included in the participant workbook can be used to determine if a performance assessment has all of the elements necessary to measure it against the quality criteria tool, or if looking for a better performance assessment is the appropriate next step. Or if developing your own assessment is also the appropriate next step. We certainly had folks who did that. The checklist is intended to help keep you focused on the critical components of the assessment and to save you time in the initial planning period by ensuring that you have the information that you need to move forward with the assessment. If you're considering implementing a performance assessment this fall in a virtual setting, this would be a good time for you to consider how you might adapt an existing performance assessment to your current environment. So as I mentioned, during our project, we had teachers who both created their own assessments as well as teachers who teachers who both created their own assessment as well as teachers who developed an assessment based on one that was already existing. So we're going to hear a video clip of Erin talking about her process for that, and so I'll ask that you please turn on your computer speakers so that you can hear the audio from the video clip.
I wrote this PBA. We didn't have anything to go off of. So it's a combination of ideas that we had as a team and a PBL that I found online that was related to what we were doing. That took a lot of time and thought, but the REL information was a good help. The checklists and making sure using that Virginia criteria tool and forming the rubric, like all of that was really helpful. Otherwise, I think I would have been floundering a lot more than I already was.
And so I want to recognize that I know that there are storms in the area and that folks may have different levels of bandwidth to see the video clip that we're showing right now. And so I want to make you all aware that if you're unable to see the video or if it's stopping and pausing for you, that the videos will be available on the REL AP website after the webinar is posted. So let's pause for a minute also and just make sure that everybody's caught up and back with us. And then just for those of you who weren't able to see the clip or had trouble with it, I just wanted to just do a quick recap and share that Erin was fortunate enough to have the support of a planning team with her at her school and in creating her assessments, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about what that process looked like. Erin?
Thanks, Carmen. I was lucky. My 6th grade science team and I developed this together so that we could all implement it. It wasn't just me. And the process was, I didn't create one from scratch. What I did was I found an existing PBL and modified some of that and then created the rest of it myself. And I used the performance assessment tool to make sure I had all the important parts necessary to create that quality PBA. And the performance assessment checklist helped me design the blueprint to make sure I was staying on point. And I also used it to make sure that I was including everything that should be there while making the PBA relevant, authentic, accessible, and realistic in terms of the material access and the timing. And then it wasn't just suiting my students, but it was suiting the students across all 5 of us as science teachers.
Right, and that's, I think, you know, a key component to this in terms of planning and collaborating with others is making sure that it works for everybody that is going to be using the assessment. I'd also like to hear from Carrie. I know, Carrie, you also did some adapting of an existing assessment, a little bit more so maybe than Erin. Can you share with us?
Thank you, Carmen. I did take an assessment from the Prince William County Science site, and I revamped the assessment to go with the performance assessment checklist of Virginia. So I changed it, and I made it a little bit more student-friendly, and I actually had the students assess themselves after they finished their own assessment, even before I did. They were showing their knowledge in a way that was hands-on and exciting for them. So it wasn't just, you know, paper pencil. It was, you know, something that they became very enthusiastic about. So, you know, it was really helpful for me to see their learning through their eyes.
Yeah, and I think that's an opportunity that performance assessments allow you to do because they do give you that ability to have students really show what they know. And so thank you both for sharing that. We're going to move on to step 3 of the process. So as Anne shared earlier, you know, we really looked at the Virginia Quality Criteria Review tool for this project to help guide teachers in both their selection of a performance assessment or the revision of the performance assessment. So the step 3 of the process uses the tool to examine the activities, the materials, and the resources of the assessment and to make the necessary revisions. So this means that applying the criteria tool aids in determining the quality of a performance assessment, but it can also be used to improve the quality. A key to this process is identifying the evidence within the performance assessment needed to satisfy the quality criteria and then applying strategies that help to improve an assessment with poor ratings. The Implementing High Quality Performance Assessment Workbook, Corey, you're right, that is a mouthful, includes an example performance assessment so that you can see how to apply the criteria and suggest strategies for improvement. The workbook also provides a workspace for you to review your own performance assessment against the criteria tool. So we'd like to see what this looks like in practice. We're going to see Carrie here talk about modifying their assessment to meet the criteria for accessibility. In this clip, is going to instruct for her performance assessment with her classroom. As part of the assessment, students were required to develop a design plan for their 3D model of the ocean. To support students' different learning styles, Carrie modified the task to provide space for students to both draw and write out their design plan. So what this looks like in practice, and afterwards I'll ask Carrie to share more about how and why she modified the assessment this way. So again, I'll ask folks to please turn your speakers on so that you can hear the audio clip.
Okay. And then on the back page, I know some of you like to write it. I also give you lines if you want to write it to go with your picture. So you can choose if you want to do the picture first and then write about this is what I need to make this, or if you want to do the writing first and then do your pictures, that's fine. Yes, ma'am.
Can you only do one?
What do you mean?
Like, let's say I only wanted to write and not do the picture. Can I just write?
Is that gonna help you and make you more comfortable, or are you visual and you need that picture?
I like it both ways.
Then I would use both. It's up to you. This is your design mode. That's why, because I know some of you like to write and some of you like to draw. That's fine. All right. Any other questions before you get started?
And I know that video might be still playing for folks, but I'm going to just go ahead and move us along because I know that people have different bandwidths. And again, the complete video will be up on the website when we post the webinar recording. And I'll just remind folks, if you could, that your speakers are off, that you don't get any annoying background noise, and then we'll ask Carrie if she can share more about modifying her assessment.
Thank you, Carmen. So what I did this year, which was a little different, I did a couple of things. One, I actually got our parent liaison to translate my project-based learning assessment for my student who is a level 1, because he could read and write in Spanish. So that's the first thing I did. So I gave his assessment to him all in Spanish. The second thing that I did is I made sure that my design plan had a portion where they could actually write their ideas down before they even started to build. And if they didn't want to write it, then they could draw it, because I had some great illustrators in my room, and they loved to draw, and they wanted to, come up with the plan that way. So I gave them that option of either writing it or drawing it, and then I had a student actually go and ask me in the clip if they could do it both ways. And I was like, if that's the way you want to do it, that's fine. So I gave them the opportunity to do both.
Great, and I'm sure that helped them in terms of being able to also engage with the task that you were asking them to do. Also want to hear from Erin. Erin, can you share through your tool to improve your assessment?
Sure. Excuse me, my PBA lent itself to authenticity by covering the watershed health, which the school happens to be pretty located close to. I used that assessment tool to make sure it was relevant by including the school and how student impact is directly related to the water's health. I also used the assessment tool while creating the grading rubric, making sure it was accessible to all of my students, and feasibility of the assessment itself. And the assessment tool kept me on track and held me accountable to creating a quality assessment. I know that looking at that assessment tool can be extremely overwhelming, especially the first couple of times you're looking at it. But the tool is extensive and all-encompassing. It also points out the deficits of previously written PBAs and/or presents a challenge to the writer to include all the pieces to create a high-quality assessment. Inequities are found using this tool, and solving those inequities can also be challenging, but it is worth it in the end when you reach all of your students.
Thanks, Erin. So, and I'd also like to just put in a little bit more of a plug for the participant workbook that we created for the project as a way of helping to navigate some of the complexity of the criteria tool. I think, what we found with working with our teachers is that helping them break it down by looking at an example performance assessment, which is included in the workbook, was really helpful, and letting them see how they can apply the tool to their own assessment. So I hope you all take a minute after the webinar to look at that resource and see if it can be of help to you. I'm sure it will. So I'm going to move us on here to step 4. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on steps 1 through 3 we focused on steps 2 3 already of the 4-step process, and we'll focus more on step 4 in the second webinar. But we did want to take some time to talk about step 4 here with you today, because we know it's part of that process. And we know that performance assessments can take more time to plan and administer, but we also know that students benefit from the opportunities to be involved in their assessments. Students can be active participants in their own assessment, learning about how they will be evaluated, and contributing their own knowledge of their strengths and challenges. So today we'll look at step 4 and hear more from our teachers on administering the performance assessments and how they were able to both plan and prepare for their assessments and engage their students. So I'll ask my performance assessment experts to describe the amount of time and the types of resources that went into administering the performance assessment, as well as what steps they took to ensure that their students were engaged. And Carrie, if we could start with you.
Thank you, Carmen. So I actually started in the summer of 2019. I worked with Erin and Gina for the first 2 sessions we met of the summer. The REL team, I met with them several times over the computer and in person to talk about it because I wasn't lucky like Erin and had a team. I was by myself at my school trying to implement this. So it does take time to plan the assessment, but I wanted to make sure that I was covering the information that was being taught. I went over the assessment several times. I went back and revamped and added things. You know, the students asked questions and we spent a day talking about the task that was going to be asked for them, and that made me go back and go, oh, so for next time I need to do this. So, you know, it does take some time or whatever, but it's really beneficial.
And Erin, how about you?
So I did the same training that Carrie did with Gina as well, but when we talk about actually the time it took to create, revise, and implement, I started about a month out from when I introduced it to my students. I worked a lot of it on my own, but in our weekly CLTs, we'd go over it as a team and adjust and modify. And then once I introduced it to my students, I gave them 3 weeks to create the end product. They used Kindles and laptops for a variety of purposes. We used our science textbooks, a variety of nonfiction literature from the library. My students used poster boards and worked with our technology coach and the green screen that we have at the school, and they created videos. I created checklists for my students to follow, and the rubric used for grading, I handed that out at the very beginning so that the students would know and have something to reference back to make sure they were creating a product that would get them a good grade and had everything included. Each class started with a mini lesson with the content for that day. And then when the lesson was over, students would gather in their groups, and I challenged them to take the newly learned content and add it into their project. And each student had a role within the group, which helped with engagement. And there were frequent check-ins with me. I also circulated the room while groups were working. I engaged in conversations with them. I answered questions, cleared confusion, and offered support as the students worked.
Now that we've heard a bit more about what it's like to implement a performance assessment and some of the supports available, let's hear from the audience again. In the chat, tell us, how does the 4-step process align with how you would typically plan for classroom assessments? What aspects of the process are similar or different to how you would implement a performance assessment in your classroom? While attendees are sharing your thoughts in the chat, let's go ahead and hear again from our implementation experts, Carrie and Erin. Please share, how does the 4-step process align with how you would typically plan for your classroom assessment, and what aspects of the 4-step process are similar or different to how you would typically implement a performance assessment in your classroom? Erin, can we hear from you first?
Sure, I was totally ready to let Carrie go first. But the 4-step, I'm a backwards planner. I was talking with somebody in the chat about backwards planning, and the way the 4-step process is laid out kind of aligns with that. You want to know your purpose for doing it. You want to know what they're going to need to know by the end and how they're going to get there. And that's how I plan on a normal day anyway. I use that 4-step process too to make sure I didn't leave anything out. Everything was included. It all made sense. And that the performance assessment was relevant to what we were learning and that it was authentic for them. They could relate to it. And then using that criterion tool, so that's specific to this particular assignment, which, like I said earlier, can be a little overwhelming, but once you get into it, you've used it a couple times, it gets a little bit easier to use, and you, at least for me, I could see myself using that criterion tool for other types of assessments as well.
Hi, this is Carrie again. I agree with Erin. Like when you're looking and planning, you need to make sure that you start with your project. Where do you want the kids to end up? So I look at the projects that I'm picking for each unit, and then that's how I plan around my lessons, because, you know, what do I want them to get out of each science objective, and how can I implement language arts in there with like maybe read alouds or some of those SOLs to get them, you know, their communication, their writing piece in.
Thank you, Erin and Carrie, so much for sharing. I see that there has been a challenge with the link, and so I want to make sure that you guys are aware we've just reposted it. There was an error in the link, and so if you were trying to take the survey, it is now corrected, and you can click on that link and go ahead and take the survey. We appreciate your participation and your willingness to provide us with feedback. I see that people start with whatever the final skill is that has to be performed, and that's similar to what Erin talked about, beginning with the end in mind. I love how much activity there has been in the chat, and how you guys have been working together and supporting one another in these responses. I would like to talk about next steps. So we're so grateful that everyone was able to join us today. We appreciate you taking the time to come out into the webinar space and share so openly in the chat and be willing to engage with our experts. I want to thank Erin and Carrie and Anne for providing such incredible expertise and sharing. We hope that you're able to join us in our webinar next week. And so thank you so much for participating today. Before we end, we'd like to take a few questions from the audience as we still have a few minutes. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat if you do have some lingering questions. Otherwise, I'm going to say the last few reminders. I can pass this along to Emma, who can talk about the last few things we want to share before we depart.
Thank you so much, Corey. So just a quick reminder, please complete the stakeholder feedback survey for this webinar. The link on this slide should work. It does work, and the one that was in the chat earlier does not, but this one definitely does. And at the end of the webinar, you will also have the opportunity to go to the stakeholder feedback survey. It will automatically take you there if you just stay on to the very end. We're also happy to provide professional development certificates. Please email Corey Hamilton Biagas at SRI if you would require documentation. We would love to see you all again next week. Please join us for part 2 in this series on August 11th from 1:30 to 3 o'clock p.m. And I will post the link to that webinar in just a second for you to register if you have not already done so. You can find additional resources related to this project, including coaching materials in the full participant workbook on the REL Appalachia website. REL Northeast and Islands offers an online course for practitioners on creating and using performance assessments. It's currently available on their website, and I know that Jessica talked about it earlier, and we included the link in the chat, and we're happy to include that again. You can also check out the Virginia Department of Education's resource page for additional information and resources on performance assessments and local alternative assessments. A copy of this PowerPoint with the sources cited in the presentation will also be available on the REL AP website. All right, thank you again for participating. We're going to add that email in the chat, and I will be happy to go back to this email address for anybody who needs to email Corey for a PD certificate. Should be able to see it on the screen now. And we will add that link for the online course in just a second here, as well as the registration for the final webinar, which is next week again on August 11th from 1:30 to 3 o'clock p.m.